The sun hung low and merciless, like a burning eye above the endless expanse of the Badlands. In that desolate stretch of cracked earth and jagged rock, no mercy was offered to wanderers. A wind, harsh and unceasing, carried with it stinging grit, tearing at any unwary traveler who dared to cross its path. Mary Beth Wainwright pressed her palm to her dusty forehead, squinting at the sun's glare, trying to pass any hint of a familiar landmark in the unending sea of rust-colored hills and dry gullies. The memory of her family's homestead, the sturdy clapboard house and its weathered fence posts, flickered at the edges of her mind like a half-forgotten dream. How long had it been since she left that place? Hours? Days? In her confusion, time had blurred into a haze of heat and worry. She took a shuddering breath, tasting dust on her tongue, and realized with a jolt of fear that she could no longer recall which direction led to the settlement. All she knew was that she was utterly, irrevocably lost. Mary Beth was 16 years old, with chestnut hair that now lay plastered to her sunburned cheeks, her eyes the color of a storm-tossed sea, wide, haunting and alive with tension, growing. Up on the frontier had taught her rugged resilience. She'd ridden horses before she could walk, learned to shoot a rifle before she'd reached her 11th year, and chased after the household chores with an industriousness born of necessity. Yet here she stood, feet aching and heart pounding, clutching a small haversack that contained only a handful of stale crackers, a half-empty canteen, and a faded portrait of her younger brother, Tuck. The portrait was the one token she had insisted on carrying when her family's wagon overturned at the edge of the Badlands. If nothing else, remembering Tuck's face gave her a spark of purpose. She had to get back to him. They had been hunting. Pa had taken her and Tuck along to the edge of the Badlands to track antelope, hoping to supply enough meat for the coming weeks. Their homestead sat not far from the Badlands' lighter skirts, enough to give opportunities for hunting, yet close enough that a family with even a hint of carelessness could veer off course and find themselves wandering into that inhospitable wilderness. Pa had insisted Mary Beth handle the rifle this time. She was a better shot than most men in their county. Tuck, younger by 4 years, had carried the canteen and a small prospector's knife. They had tracked a buck to a narrow ravine that hummed with an uneasy stillness. When Mary Beth fired, the deer stumbled, tumbled away, and then seemed to vanish into the tapestry of thorny scrub. They pursued it, only to find their path back obliterated by an ambush of swirling dust. In the blink of an eye, a sudden gust seized their wagon off its path, tossing it into a ditch and sending the horses scattering. Her last clear memory was her father shouting her name just before everything went dark. Now she stumbled forward, guided by the instincts that had served her well on every frontier trail, but the Badlands showed no mercy to dreams of home. Her boots sank into the loose shale as she scrambled up a narrow rise, her heart thundering as if it would burst from her chest. She halted at the crest, arms trembling, and forced herself to look around. Cliffs of ochre and sienna rose like the spines of slumbering beasts, their peaks ragged as ancient scars. A river of cracked earth ran between them, twisting and spitting. In the afternoon heat, Mary Beth's pulse quickened at the sight of it. Water meant life, or a mirage of life, and she knelt to search its bed for any sign of moisture. She ran her fingers along a small depression where dust clung to her skin, but the ground was as dry as bone. A low cry escaped her lips. It wasn't just her body that was failing, her mind was fraying too. Panic nipped at the edges of her courage, reminding her of the tales her mother had told, stories of families who vanished in these Badlands, only to be absorbed by the unforgiving terrain. She shut her eyes, took a shuddering breath, and forced herself to recall the maps Pa had drawn. That morning, a rough sketch etched in charcoal on a scrap of paper. The homestead lay northwest beyond the Tooth Ridge, then veered east at Buffalo Creek, but the wind had torn the map from Pa's grasp, and Mary Beth lacked the faintest clue which ridge was the tooth, or where Buffalo Creek twisted like a silken ribbon. She felt tears threaten, but she would not indulge them. The work of her hands and heart had to be bigger than her fear. She rose, brushing the leaning shards of shale from her dress skirts, and tested the air. No clouds covered the sky. No crows circled overhead. In the distance, a ribbon of dust, a cloud raised by a herd of buffalo, or perhaps by a cruel wind, stretched from horizon to horizon. Could there be buffalo out here? She almost laughed in disbelief. She remembered Grandpa's warnings. The buffalo had long fled this country, driven away by hunters and encroaching settlers. Still, the sight of that dust line fueled hope that maybe humans were near. Perhaps a cattle drive or a roving trader, something more human than the merciless landscape around her. Her stomach grumbled, a hollow, insistent reminder that her body was battered by hunger and thirst. She thought of Pa's voice, stern but kind, teaching her to respect the land and never take it for granted. If only he could see her now, every muscle in her body screaming for relief. She pressed on. The ground sloped downward, and Mary Beth hesitated at the brink of a narrow ravine. The forbidding walls jutted on either side, forcing her to descend. In single file, she tested each step, wary of loose stones that would betray her presence. As she picked her way down, she felt an unnatural stillness settle around her, as if the land itself held its breath. The silence was broken only by the distant rattling of a small cascade of pebbles, perhaps a goat or a badger scurrying in. Its den. She pressed on, fingers trailing along the rough sandstone, as if it could lead her to salvation. At the bottom, the floor of the ravine was lined with brittle sagebrush and the brittle husk of ancient plant life. A lonely tumbleweed skittered across her path, propelled by the same wind that whispered sorrowfully through the canyon walls. Mary Beth knelt and pried at the dusty soil beneath it, searching for any sign of dampness. A few inches down, her fingertips brushed something cold and wet. A trickle of moisture clung to the rock face, seeping in slow, reluctant drips. Her heart leaped. She pressed her dusty lips against the rock, drinking deeply of that frozen manna. Each gulp was a revelation. She felt as if the liquid flame down her throat rekindled a smoldering ember of hope. She spent the next minutes crouched there, letting the cold water slowly quench the dryness in her chest. When she emerged, Mary Beth felt galvanized, not fully restored, but alive in a way she had not been moments before. She refilled her canteen from the trickle, wary of taking more than she could carry. She tucked the canteen into her sash. Next, to the small prospector's knife Tuck had insisted they pack as a keepsake. She slid the knife into the folds of her dress, vowing silently that she would take the Badlands as they came, but she would not yield to them. When she looked up, the world had shifted. The sun had dipped lower, casting long, sinister shadows. Into the canyon, she rose, steadying herself, and forced her gaze upward toward the jagged skyline. She steeled her nerves and began to climb. The ascent was grueling. Loose stones skidded under her boots, sending her stumbling several times. Sweat beaded at her temples, threading into her hairline. Each time she faltered, she thought of Tuck's laughter, light and musical, and the way their pa's big hands had ruffled her hair when she was still too young to carry a rifle. Memories loomed like ghosts, bittersweet and haunting. If she could just survive until the last streaks of sunlight faded, maybe the Boy Scouts patrol from the neighboring county would make their way out here for a late dust-up. They often gathered buffalo droppings or tracked coyotes and wolves. Perhaps they would find the overturned wagon. Perhaps, but hope was a double-edged sword in a place like this. A sudden screech echoed from above, like a coyote's howl laced with human suffering. Mary Beth's body tensed, fingers tightening around the handle of her knife. She whispered a prayer she barely believed, for mercy, for a sign. The canyon walls reverberated with that anguished cry, an echo that faded into nothingness. She swallowed hard, fisted her skirts and pressed forward, heedful of every sound. Then, as she reached a small ledge where the rock yielded to a sheer slope, she spotted something familiar. A crude arrowhead embedded in the soft rock, its obsidian tip glinting in the waning light. Native craftsmanship, the realization sent a thrill and a shudder of fear through her. If Navajo hunters passed through these badlands, that meant danger or perhaps opportunity. She paused on the ledge, trying to catch her breath. The arrowhead, just a single, sharp reminder that the land did not belong to her. Her family had settled here only recently, hoping for a better life in this wide, wild land. But the Navajo had lived on these grounds for generations, guided by traditions that bound them to the land, in ways settlers like her could never understand. Maybe whoever had lost or discarded that arrowhead would know she was here. Maybe they would help her find her way. Or maybe they would see her as an intruder, a threat. She traced the arrowhead's outline with a trembling fingertip. If only she could recall Grandpa's stories of Navajo hospitality or caution. She had heard how travelers sometimes found safe refuge with friendly shepherds, but those tales felt as fragile as spider silk when the wind howled greedily though. In response, the figure stepped forward a few paces, and the last of the light revealed a high cheekbone, dark and solemn eyes, and a face dusted with ochre from the earth. The man wore a broad-brimmed hat, fashioned from hide, and beneath it, long dark hair braided in thin plaits that swayed in the wind. A woolen blanket was draped over his back, the pattern of red, black, and white stripes unmistakably Navajo. He dropped the bundle, revealing a staff carved from a sturdy juniper branch, its tip worn smooth by years of travel. At his hip, a set of sheep bells jingled softly, carrying the faint memory of a herd somewhere beyond the rocks. For a moment, they stood there, separated by what felt like a chasm of centuries, a settler girl whose footsteps had desecrated land that had been sacred to the people who shaped it for generations. The shepherd's dark eyes met hers, and for an instant, Mary Beth felt exposed, as though he saw not just her figure, but her very soul, stripped of pretense. He spoke in a low voice, so soft that the words fluttered away like a moth in the wind. "You wander far from home, little one." His accent was lyrical, each syllable carrying a weight of caution. Mary Beth nodded, swallowing back the fear that choked her. She sank to her knees, bowing her head. Pride and desperation warred in her chest, but she could not stand and face him again with her resolve intact. I am lost. I need to find my family. Please, can you help me?" Her voice cracked under the strain, but the sincerity in her plea trembled in the air. He paused, as though measuring the truth in her words. The shepherd reached out a hand, rough with calluses, and touched her shoulder gently. The touch was cool, a lifeline cast to a drowning child. He nodded slowly, and in his eyes Mary Beth saw neither judgment nor pity, but something darker: curiosity, respect, and cautious empathy. He gestured toward the plateau's edge, where dusk had knitted shadows into the folds of the land. "Tomorrow, at first light, we ride toward Shiprock," he said. "You must rest until then." Mary Beth's pulse surged with a mixture of relief and lingering disbelief. "Shiprock," she whispered. She had heard of it, a jagged formation that jutted from the desert farther west, marking the border of lands that many settlers dared not cross. If she reached Shiprock, perhaps there would be more travelers, traders, or even a patrol that could guide her home. She considered her options for a long moment, then nodded. The shepherd turned, retrieved the bundle, and began walking. Mary Beth rose slowly, shaking as if awakening from a fevered dream. She followed him, each step a hesitant promise that she would survive. They crested the plateau and descended into a shallow valley where a cluster of sandstone boulders provided a sheltered nook The shepherd laid down his blanket and gestured for Marybeth to sit. Without questioning him, she perched on a flat rock, pulling her skirts tight around her knees. She had not felt so weary, so contrite as she did in that moment. The wind whispered through the valley, rustling the thin grass and carrying with it a sad, haunting refrain that seemed to speak of the land's ancient sorrow. He knelt before her, loosening the canteen from her belt. Without a word, he held it to her lips. She drank deeply, counting her breaths, tasting the water that felt like a blessing from some higher power. When she finished, he took back the canteen and examined it carefully, as though testing its contents. Then he set it aside, reached into the folds of his blanket, and produced a small bundle of parched corn and dried beans. He offered it to her. Marybeth's fingers trembled as she took it, unraveling the cloth to reveal the meager rations. She bowed her head and ate in silence, mind scrolling through thoughts of gratitude, guilt, and awe. In that dimming light, the shepherd watched her quietly, his face a mask of gentle inscrutability. Marybeth felt the weight of his gaze, but instead of cowering beneath it, she met it with a fierce, unspoken plea. She would honor this kindness with every fiber of her. Being night settled like an inky cloak, and the wind carried a sudden chill. The shepherd retrieved his blanket again and extended it toward her. Marybeth hesitated, pride still whispering that she could manage on her own. But a better voice prevailed, and she took the blanket, letting it wrap around her shoulders like a benediction. The shepherd knelt and struck flint against stone, and a small flame sputtered to life. He coaxed it into a circle of glowing embers and set a handful of dry branches on top. The fire sprang to life with a crackle, casting dancing shadows across their faces. Marybeth settled beside the fire, knees drawn to her chest, and watched the flickering flames. They hovered on the edge of the camp, a fragile barrier between them and the boundless expanse of the Badlands. She felt a strange sensation welling inside her, part wonder, part reverence, part fear. She turned her gaze to the shepherd, who sat with crossed legs, hands folded over his staff. A faint melody, like a lament for a lost world, floated from his lips, an ancient tune that drifted across the flickering light. It was as if the song itself was woven from the bones of the land. Marybeth closed her eyes and let its mournful beauty sink into her bones. When the last ember glowed a dull red, the shepherd fell silent. The stars had come out, innumerable and cold, like pinpricks of hope scattered across the velvet sky. Marybeth raised her eyes to them, feeling small yet invincible, carried on some silent promise that tomorrow might bring her closer to home. She opened her mouth to speak, to ask his name, or why he lingered here in the Badlands instead of staying with his people on the mesas beyond. But the words died in her throat. She could not yet trust speech, not until she had caught her breath and untangled the knot of fear and gratitude inside her. Instead, she sank onto her heels and watched the shepherd from the corner of her eye. The firelight revealed the faint lines of age at the edges of his dark eyes. His face was stripped of pretense, quiet, stoic, and kind. He closed his eyes, leaning his head back until it rested against the stones behind him. Marybeth studied every detail of his face, committing it to memory. The high cheekbones, the ridge of his brows, the way his lips twitched as if on the verge of a smile. She shivered as a cold breeze swept through the canyon, and the fire crackled once, twice, then snapped as the final log burned through. Darkness enveloped them both, but Marybeth felt a strange warmth deeper than any ember. She whispered so softly that even she could barely hear it. "Thank you." The shepherd opened his eyes and turned his head toward her. For a moment, they simply held each other's gaze. In his eyes, she saw not pity nor suspicion, but a quiet recognition, an understanding that their fates were entwined, at least until dawn. He tipped his head toward a small hollow beside the fire. "Rest," he murmured, his voice low and gravelly, The Badlands reveal their paths only to those who wait. Mary Beth nodded dumbly, hefted the blanket higher about her shoulders, and pressed her back against a cool boulder. She stared into the pitch-black canyon, where silhouettes of towering spires loomed like ancient sentinels. Her mind churned with questions. Where did he come from? Where did he go when the morning came? And, most urgent of all, would he truly guide her home? She closed her eyes, letting exhaustion reclaim her. Firelight danced across the stones, weaving shadows that seemed to suggest shapes moving at the edge of her vision. But she refused to give in to panic. Tomorrow, she would follow him. Tomorrow, she would find her way back to the life she had lost, and the brother who must be wondering if she had perished in these cursed Badlands. As sleep claimed her, her last thought was a wish, half prayer, that dawn did not bring wolves. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow I have a special story for you. Mary Beth absorbed his words, realizing that a lifetime of stories lay hidden behind his stoic presence. She tilted her head back and met his eyes. You saved me. I can never thank you enough. He nodded once, as if acknowledging the simplicity of her gratitude. Then he retrieved a rolled cloth from his saddlebag and handed it to her. Mary Beth unwrapped it and found a wide-brimmed leather hat and a small pair of goggles with amber lenses. She frowned. What is this for? He slid the hat onto her head, the brim shading her eyes from the brutal sun. Then he gently placed the goggles over her face, fitting them snugly around her temples. You will ride more safely, he said. The sun's glare is fierce on the plains. The hat shields your head. The lenses cut the glare and protect your eyes from dust. She felt his kindness unfurl like a hidden spring in her chest. Gratitude and embarrassment warred inside her. She had left home under the assumption she could handle anything, yet she had needed rescue. She swallowed, pitched her voice low. Thank you. He nodded. They sat beneath the juniper for perhaps another half hour, letting the heat ebb from the day's scar. Then he rose, tossed the lens cloth back into the saddlebag, and waved for Mary Beth to join him. They resumed their journey, forging onward across the empty expanse. The ground shimmered, and the sky pressed a deafening brightness upon them. Mary Beth tightened the reins, urging her horse forward, cutting into the wind with her jaw set. Her mind flitted back to home. Her father's stern laughter, her mother's soft lullabies, Tuck's mischievous grin. Each memory bolstered her resolve. She would not collapse now that someone believed in her. The hours passed in a blur of sun and dust. They rode in silence until the midday horizon blurred into heat waves. Occasionally, Mary Beth caught small signs of life, a hawk soaring overhead, a jackrabbit disappearing into a burrow. But save for the shepherd's mare and her own bay, no other creature braved the open plain. By late afternoon, the monolith of shiprock dwarfed the surrounding plateau, its jagged peak cutting into the sky like a titan's arrow. The land around it was littered with smaller buttes and rock formations, each a testament to centuries of wind and water. As they neared, Mary Beth's chest tightened. She felt as though she stood on the edge of two worlds, the Badlands behind her and a future uncertain yet beckoning. The shepherd guided them around a cluster of spiny yucca, their arrow-like leaves glinting in the waning sun. His demeanor became sharper, more alert. Mary Beth followed his lead, letting her instincts, honed by frontier life, guide her. They rounded a low ridge and saw the base of the rock rising before them, a plateau of cracked earth leading to sheer vertical walls. A clutch of tents and wagons lay near the plateau's edge. Settlers, traders, and some of the tribe had gathered, here marking a neutral way station of sorts. Smoke curled from a small circle of cooking fires, and distant shouts echoed off the stone. Mary Beth felt a surge of relief at the sight of human life. She tightened her grip around the reins, letting her bay speed toward the encampment, but as they approached, a hush fell over the gathering. Figures began to emerge from between wagons, armed men with rifle barrels gleaming. Traders snapped shut wooden crates, shielding their eyes from the sun. A party of mounted guards, their armor battered and dull, rode to meet them halfway. They corralled the horses with practiced skill. Marybeth's heart hammered. She glanced at the shepherd, who sat tall in his saddle, his dark eyes fixed on the approaching men. None of them wore the tribal blankets she had come to know. Instead, they sported the ragged coats and dusty hats of prospectors and traders. One man rode forward, a broad-shouldered figure with a scar across his jaw and a rifle slung across his back. He reined his horse in front of the shepherd, eyeing him. Marybeth's grasp on the reins tightened. A bead of sweat trickled down her temple. She studied the man's posture, defensive, suspicious, recognizing in him the same caution that had ruled these Badlands for decades. They were outsiders who survived by bartering and by gun. The scarred man dismounted with a huff, his spurs jangling against the horse's flanks. He stared at the shepherd, then at Marybeth. "Who are you? What business do you have near Shiprock?" His voice was loud, gruff, and edged with the steel of someone used to enforcing order. Marybeth slid off her horse, heart pounding, but the shepherd remained seated, calm as a still pond. "This young woman is lost," he said, his voice low, measured. "I guide her to safety." The scarred man's lip curled. He took a step back, raising his rifle and sweeping the barrel across the sagebrush. "This is Navajo territory," he snarled. "We tolerate no trespassers." A murmur rippled through the assembled onlookers, voices rising, fearful and uneasy. Marybeth's blood ran cold. She wrapped her arms around herself defensively, but the shepherd made no move. He met the scarred man's gaze, his dark eyes unwavering. "I mean no harm," he said. "I bring her to those who can help." The scarred man hesitated, as if weighing the shepherd's words. The horses shifted nervously, and the tension thrummed in the air. Was this to be refuge or confrontation? For a heartbeat, the world held its breath. Then the scarred man nodded tersely, gesturing with his rifle for them to follow. "Step aside and bring your horse. We'll take her to Father Beaumont's mission. He'll know what to do." Marybeth exhaled, relief washing over her like rain. She glanced at the shepherd. He nodded once, curtly. They led their horses into the circle of tents, passing a group of women at a cooking fire who glanced up with curiosity. Children peered from behind canvas flaps, their dark eyes widening at the sight of Marybeth's dirt-streaked face. As they walked, Marybeth noticed Father Beaumont's mission, a squat adobe building with a small cross carved above the door, its sun-baked walls blending with the earth. Smoke drifted from the chimney, and a bell hung over the entrance, silent now but waiting to toll. She felt as though she had crossed into another realm, a place where she might find not only help, but answers to so many questions pressing on. Her heart. They reached the mission's threshold and were ushered inside by a young nun with gentle eyes. The interior was cool and dim, the scent of pinewood and incense lingering in the air. Marybeth's gaze swept across the simple furnishings, a small wooden altar, a collection of well-worn Bibles, and a table where two men in clerical collars whispered urgently. Father Beaumont, a tall man with kind eyes and greying hair, rose to greet them. He stepped forward, kneeling slightly, and offered Marybeth his hand. "Child, you have endured much. Come, sit by the hearth and rest." He guided her to a wooden bench beside a modest fireplace. Marybeth's legs felt like water beneath her. She settled on the bench, smoothing her hair in trembling fingers. The shepherd dismounted and bowed his head briefly before turning to adjust the blankets across his shoulders. He placed the reins over a post and slid onto a stool in the corner, his dark eyes scanning the room with a watchful serenity. Father Beaumont produced a bowl of steaming broth and set it before Mary Beth. "This will warm you." She took the bowl in both hands, the heat rising into her face as she sipped slowly, tasting salt and savory bones. She felt thirst and hunger melt away with each swallow. The priest pressed a hand to her shoulder. "You have come a long way. We will help you find your family." His reassurance was a balm to her frayed nerves, but gratitude warred with guilt. She was indebted to so many strangers in this harsh land. Outside, the wind rattled the mission's wooden shutters, as though reminding them of the Badlands' ever-present reach. Mary Beth closed her eyes, and sleep beckoned, gentle and unavoidable. She let her head fall back and drifted into a brief, uneasy slumber. When she stirred, the sun hung lower in the sky, suffusing the mission's chapel with amber light. Father Beaumont and the shepherd were in hushed conversation beside a small map spread across a simple wooden table. The priest wore a contemplative expression as he traced a finger along a drawn line, a route to the Wainwright homestead. Mary Beth rose and approached them. The moment she stepped into the circle of their quiet deliberation, the shepherd looked up. His dark eyes met hers, and for a flickering moment, Mary Beth sensed the unspoken bond he offered, an understanding that transcended the boundaries between their worlds. Father Beaumont placed a gentle hand on her arm. "We will send a rider to your home before nightfall. It is a 2-day journey over rough ground, but they will leave at first light. You should rest until then." Mary Beth bowed her head in gratitude. She cast a glance at the shepherd, who gave a small nod. The nun who had served the broth appeared with a clean shift and a basin of water. She guided Mary Beth to a small side room, where a cot lay draped with a clean blanket. Exhaustion pooled in her limbs, and she collapsed onto the cot, burying her face in the pillow as tears of relief and lingering fear slid down her cheeks. She woke sometime later to the hush of activity. Footsteps in the hall, the creak of a wooden door. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and lantern light flickered through the windows. She sat up, blinking, and noticed a tray of food, bread, cheese, and fresh water, beside the cot. She rose and dressed as best she could in her threadbare skirt and shirt, brushing the last of the dust from her hair. When she opened the door, Father Beaumont stood waiting, holding 2 steaming plates and a cup of tea. He offered a nod and stepped aside to reveal another figure who had slipped quietly to her side, the shepherd, whose presence felt as constant and quiet as the looming spire of Shiprock. "Eat," Father Beaumont urged. "You need your strength." Mary Beth took the plate, her hands still unsteady. She seated herself at a small table across from the shepherd. He took a seat to her left, his dark eyes meeting her with a tenderness she did not fully understand. She offered him a slice of bread with a grateful look, and he accepted it without a word, breaking it slowly and dipping it into his tea. They ate in reflective silence, the hush punctuated only by the soft clink of utensils and the distant toll of the mission bell. Mary Beth's mind spun with questions. Who was this shepherd, and why had he chosen to help her? Would her father and Tuck await news of her safe return? Each bite tasted of salt and something deeper, hope. When they finished, Father Beaumont poured more tea into the shepherd's cup. Mary Beth rose and crossed to his side, pressing her own cup into his hands. "I wish I could repay you," she whispered, her voice trembling. He stared at the cup as though seeing it for the first time, before meeting her gaze. "Your safety is reward enough. Be kind to others when you can." Mary Beth nodded, tears flickering in her eyes. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to voice her gratitude, but the words lodged in her throat. The priest cleared his throat gently. "Rest now. Tomorrow's journey will be long, but the ride will reunite you with your family." She sank into a chair, and Father Beaumont and the shepherd bowed their heads briefly before slipping from the chapel. The lantern's glow cast the rough-hewn wooden pews in soft silhouette. Marybeth's gaze drifted to the small cross above the altar, and she felt a surge of quiet faith take root in her heart. The shepherd paused in the doorway before leaving. He turned and spoke, his voice carrying the weight of the canyon's ancient wisdom. "Meet me at dawn. I will deliver your news to your family." Marybeth swallowed, nodded, and watched him depart. He walked back toward the room where Marybeth had slept, but before he reached the door, he paused, glanced over his shoulder, and disappeared down the dim corridor. Marybeth closed her eyes and pressed her palms against the cool wooden arms of the chair. The wind moaned outside, rattling the shutters. She felt a flicker of unease. The mission was a haven, but the Badlands ever loomed beyond its adobe walls. Relief and apprehension warred within her. She was closer to home, but that promise held its own dangers. What if her family was gone? What if she had been gone too long and they had given up hope? She shook her head, banishing the dread. She would not let fear stand between her and the promise of reunion. She rose and crossed back to the small side room, arranging the blankets on the cot before lying down. The scent of sage lingered in the mission, steeping her senses in a curious calm. She reached for a handful of the shepherd's old blankets folded at the foot of the cot and wrapped them around her. As her eyes grew heavy, she thought of the shepherd's words, "Be kind to others when you can." She wondered if she would ever find him again after she left. Night deepened, and the mission's lanterns dimmed one by one. Marybeth drifted into sleep, her dreams a swirl of sandstone cliffs and the gentle press of the shepherd's hand on her shoulder. In the dim space between dreams, she sensed the vastness of the canyon beyond the mission's shelter, the breath of the Badlands that carried countless stories in its wind. The first grey light of dawn found Marybeth already waiting at the door of the chapel. The sky was just beginning to pale, and the chill of the early hour clung to her limbs. Father Beaumont, wrapped in a faded woolen cloak, appeared in the doorway, carrying a carved wooden horn and a coiled rope. At his side stood the shepherd, who held a pair of saddlebags slung over one arm. He wore his leather hat and goggles, as though preparing for another journey. Father Beaumont greeted her with a gentle nod. "The rider will leave at first light. Are you ready?" She swallowed hard, straightened her shoulders, and offered a resolute nod. He handed her the horn. "In case you need us, blow this, but trust the messenger. He knows the way." Marybeth took the horn with trembling fingers, the weight of it a tangible reminder of her tenuous link between two worlds. She turned to the shepherd. "Thank you." He inclined his head. "Be safe." His dark eyes held hers for a heartbeat that stretched longer than the canyon's shadow. Then he gestured to the horses waiting outside. Marybeth slipped the horn into her sash and followed him out into the cold morning air. The horses stood beside the mission's corral, their breaths steaming in the chill. The rider, an older man in a wide-brimmed hat, held the reins of a fine sorrel mare. He studied Marybeth with a respectful nod, then mounted as soon as she approached. The shepherd guided Marybeth to her horse, then helped her mount. The leather saddle creaked beneath her as she settled into place. She wrapped her legs around the horse's sides, drawing on the same instincts that had guided her through the Badlands. The rider kicked his mare's flanks, and they moved off with crisp purpose, weaving through the encampment as torches sputtered against the grey dawn. Settlers and traders stirred in their wagons, some pausing to watch Marybeth pass. She felt a mix of apprehension and excitement. Each step brought her closer to home, yet farther from the shepherd who had saved her. She looked back once, and the shepherd stood outside the mission, leaning on his staff, watching her go. Then he turned and slipped back inside as though disappearing into a shadow. The rider guided the sorrel westward, and Marybeth followed on the bay, hooves rising and falling in a steady rhythm. The chill receded with the sun's ascent, and the plain before them roused itself into colors of copper and gold. Shiprock's spire glowed in the morning light, a silent witness to her journey. Marybeth felt a knot of excitement tighten in her chest. Each beat of her heart was a step closer to Tuck, to Pa's proud grin, to the familiar creak of the homestead door. Behind them, the mission faded from sight, its adobe walls blending with the earth. Ahead lay a dusty trail that wound through plateaus and across washes, leading to small clusters of pioneer settlements. They would ride until dusk, the rider promising to reach a supply post by nightfall. Marybeth's mind teemed with anticipation and anxiety. What if her family had already moved on? What if the Wainwright homestead was silent and empty? She cupped her fist around the horn at her waist, feeling its smooth wood against her skin. If her journey took a turn for the worse, she had a lifeline, but she refused to consider that possibility. Pa's maps, though torn, had guided her thus far with uncanny precision. If they held true, her home lay a day's ride beyond the next plateau. The rider urged his mare onward, and the three horses kicked up plumes of dust as they trotted across. The plain, the wind carried the scent of sage and the distant promise of rain. Marybeth felt the bay respond to her hands, matching stride for stride with the seasoned sorrel. With each passing hour, the Badlands' ruthless isolation gave way to the more forgiving terrain of rolling grasslands, dotted with junipers and small buttes. At midday, they paused by a stock of water hidden beneath a tangled copse of scrub oak. The rider tied his mare to a low branch and led her to the edge of a shallow spring, cupping his hands to scoop cool water for her thirsty tongue. Marybeth followed suit with her bay. She knelt, letting the water fill her cupped palms, and drank. Deeply, tasting the earth's sweet gift, the rider settled beside her, tilting his hat back to wipe sweat from his brow. He was a weathered man, perhaps in his 50s, with a lined face and steady eyes that spoke of a lifetime spent in the saddle. "I'm John Penn," he said, offering a nod. "Your letter said to find you at Shiprock." Marybeth dipped her head respectfully. Marybeth Wainwright. She clutched the reins, her heart fluttering with excitement and nerves. Penn studied her face. "You've had a rough go. That shepherd out there, he saved more than just your life." He nodded toward the mission that lay miles behind. Marybeth swallowed. "He was a gift. I don't even know his name." Penn's jaw clenched, a flicker of something in his eyes, perhaps a memory or a warning, but he said nothing. He mounted and urged his mare to stand. Marybeth rose to her stirrups, settled back into the saddle, and followed him as the sun climbed overhead. The ride resumed in silence, each rider wrapped in his own thoughts. Marybeth's mind raced, imagining Tuck's face the moment he saw her return, the big, warm grin Pa would give her. She forced the smile that threatened, urging the bay on beside Penn's horse. By late afternoon, the landscape changed as they entered a region dotted with small farms and ranches. Fences creaked under the wind's pull, and fields stubbled with the remains of last year's winter wheat stretched toward the horizon. Marybeth recognized the patterns in the ground, clumps of mesquite, low stone walls marking property lines. Her pulse quickened. She was close. Penn slowed his mare as they approached a crossroads marked by a weathered signpost. One arrow pointed north to a smattering of small cabins. The other pointed south to a cluster of buildings that could only be the Wainwright homestead. He glanced over his shoulder, catching Marybeth's gaze. "This is as far as I go," he said, voice tinged with something like regret and respect. "Your family waits down that road." He pointed south. Marybeth dismounted, eyes shining with tears she did not trust herself to shed. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. Penn inclined his head. "Ride safe." And with that, he nudged his mare forward, trotting north toward the cabins. Marybeth climbed back into the saddle and adjusted her goggles. She felt a knot of anticipation tighten in her chest. Every sense felt sharper, as though the air itself carried her. Family's presence. She guided the bay south along the dirt road. The world narrowed to the rhythmic thud of hooves and her own breath. The sun dipped lower, casting elongated shadows across the plains. The homestead's small farm buildings emerged in the distance, whitewashed walls gleaming, fences bowing. Under the weight of late-blooming lilies and the familiar silhouette of Pa's barn standing against the sky, her heart pounded so fiercely she thought it might burst in her chest. She urged her bay to a trot, then to a canter. With each passing fence post, her memories flooded back. The oak tree where she had hidden behind on hot summer days, Tuck chasing chickens in the yard, her mother's lavender soaps buzzed with bees in the garden. The Wainwright place, a sanctuary of simple joys, stood just beyond her reach. At the gate, a figure emerged with wild arms. Tuck. He dashed forward, his straw hat flapping in his outstretched hand, eyes wide with joy and disbelief. The bay neighed as Marybeth reined it in, sweat streaking her dusty cheeks. She squeezed the reins, bringing the horse to a halt. Then she slid from the saddle, boots crunching on the dry earth. "Tuck!" Her voice cracked as she buried her. Arms around her younger brother, his laughter light and relieved. He pulled her tight as though ensuring she was real, pressing his cheek against hers. Marybeth felt a surge of emotions, relief, love, forgiveness. Pa emerged from the porch of the clapboard house, rifle resting against the railing. His broad shoulders and salt and pepper beard were unmistakable. He strode toward them, his face mixture of joy and lingering fear. "Marybeth," he said, voice thick with emotion. He dropped the rifle and enveloped her in a bear hug, lifting her off the ground for a heartbeat. God be praised. Marybeth pressed her face into his neck, breathing in the scent of worn leather and lavender soap. "I'm home, Pa." He set her down, staring at her face as though memorizing every detail. Then he stepped back and wiped a tear from his eye. "How did you... where?" She glanced at the horizon, where the fading light cast long shadows across the plains. "I was lost, but someone guided me home." She lifted her hand to brush a stray lock of hair from her face, her gaze drifting to the east. Pa followed her line of sight, noticing the bay and the empty saddle where a stranger once rode. He placed a hand on Tuck's shoulder, then turned back to Marybeth. His voice was low and tremored with gratitude. "Who?" Marybeth hesitated, tears welling in her eyes. "He's Navajo. He saved me in the Badlands and guided me to Shiprock." She swallowed, searching for his face in her mind's eye. He never asked for anything in return. Tuck's eyes glimmered. "Marybeth, Mama's been calling you for days." Marybeth patted Tuck's back gently. "I know." She turned to Pa. "Father Beaumont and the shepherd asked that I not reveal his name." Pa's brow furrowed. "But you must find him. He's part of our family now." Marybeth nodded, gazing into the lengthening shadows of the dust-choked plains. "I will, someday, but for now, I've found home." As they walked across the yard toward the clapboard house, Tuck's arm looped through hers, Pa's hand on her shoulder, Marybeth felt the weight of the journey recede. She inhaled the familiar scents, fresh-turned soil, lavender, and the faintest echo of juniper from the Badlands beyond. She paused at the threshold, looking back once toward the horizon where Shiprock's silhouette warned of all that lay between them and her new life. The sun dipped below the western rim, casting the Wainwright homestead in a glow of honeyed light. Marybeth stepped inside as her mother embraced her, the warmth of home closing around her like a blanket. The last golden rays settled on her face, and she closed her eyes, feeling both fragile and invincible. In the distance, a lone coyote howled, and the shadows of the Badlands whispered of the shepherd who would forever remain a guardian in her heart. End of part 2. That story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now back to the story. Marybeth slipped the horn into her sash and followed him out into the cold morning air. The horses stood beside the mission's corral, their breath steaming in the chill. The rider, an older man in a wide-brimmed hat, held the reins of a fine sorrel mare. He studied Marybeth with a respectful nod, then mounted as soon as she approached. The shepherd guided Marybeth to her horse, then helped her mount. The leather saddle creaked beneath her as she settled into place. She wrapped her legs around the horse's sides, drawing on the same instincts that had guided her through the Badlands. The rider kicked his mare's flanks, and they moved off with crisp purpose, weaving through the encampment as torches sputtered. Against the grey dawn, settlers and traders stirred in their wagons, some pausing to watch Marybeth pass. She felt a mix of apprehension and excitement. Each step brought her closer to home, yet farther from the shepherd who had saved her. She looked back once, and the shepherd stood outside the mission, leaning on his staff, watching her go. Then he turned and slipped back inside, as though disappearing into a shadow. The rider guided the sorrel westward, and Marybeth followed on the bay, hooves rising and falling in a steady rhythm. The chill receded with the sun's ascent, and the plain before them roused itself into colors of copper and gold. Shiprock's spire glowed in the morning light, a silent witness to her journey. Marybeth felt a knot of excitement tighten in her chest. Each beat of her heart was a step closer to Tuck, to Pa's proud grin, to the familiar creak of the homestead door. Behind them, the mission faded from sight, its adobe walls blending with the earth. Ahead lay a dusty trail that wound through plateaus and across washes, leading to small clusters of pioneer settlements. They would ride until dusk, the rider promising to reach a supply post by nightfall. Marybeth's mind teemed with anticipation and anxiety. What if her family had already moved on? What if the Wainwright homestead was silent and empty? She cupped her fist around the horn at her waist, feeling its smooth wood against her skin. If her journey took a turn for the worse, she had a lifeline, but she refused to consider that possibility. Pa's maps, though torn, had guided her thus far with uncanny precision. If they held true, her home lay a day's ride beyond the next plateau. The rider urged his mare onward, and the three horses kicked up plumes of dust as they trotted across. The plain, the wind carried the scent of sage and the distant promise of rain. Marybeth felt the bay respond to her hands, matching stride for stride with the seasoned sorrel. With each passing hour, the Badlands' ruthless isolation gave way to the more forgiving terrain of rolling grasslands, dotted with junipers and small buttes. At midday, they paused by a stock of water hidden beneath a tangled copse of scrub oak. The rider tied his mare to a low branch and led her to the edge of a shallow spring, cupping his hands to scoop cool water for her thirsty tongue. Marybeth followed suit with her bay. She knelt, letting the water fill her cupped palms, and drank, deeply, tasting the earth's sweet gift. The rider settled beside her, tilting his hat back to wipe sweat from his brow. He was a weathered man, perhaps in his 50s, with a lined face and steady eyes that spoke of a lifetime spent in the saddle. "I'm John Penn," he said, offering a nod. "Your letter said to find you at Shiprock." Marybeth dipped her head respectfully. Marybeth Wainwright. She clutched the reins, her heart fluttering with excitement and nerves. Penn studied her face. "You've had a rough go. That shepherd out there, he saved more than just your life." He nodded toward the mission that lay miles behind. Marybeth swallowed. "He was a gift. I don't even know his name." Penn's jaw clenched, a flicker of something in his eyes, perhaps a memory or a warning, but he said nothing. He mounted and urged his mare to stand. Marybeth rose to her stirrups, settled back into the saddle, and followed him as the sun climbed overhead. The ride resumed in silence, each rider wrapped in his own thoughts. Mary Beth's mind raced, imagining Tuck's face the moment he saw her return, the big, warm grin Pa would give her. She forced the smile that threatened, urging the bay on beside Penn's horse. By late afternoon, the landscape changed as they entered a region dotted with small farms and ranches. Fences creaked under the wind's pull, and fields stubbled with the remains of last year's winter wheat stretched toward the horizon. Mary Beth recognized the patterns in the ground, clumps of mesquite, low stone walls marking property lines. Her pulse quickened. She was close. Penn slowed his mare as they approached a crossroads marked by a weathered signpost. One arrow pointed north to a smattering of small cabins. The other pointed south to a cluster of buildings that could only be the Wainwright homestead. He glanced over his shoulder, catching Mary Beth's gaze. "This is as far as I go," he said, voice tinged with something like regret and respect. "Your family waits down that road." He pointed south. Mary Beth dismounted, eyes shining with tears she did not trust herself to shed. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. Penn inclined his head. "Ride safe." And with that, he nudged his mare forward, trotting north toward the cabins. Mary Beth climbed back into the saddle and adjusted her goggles. She felt a knot of anticipation tighten in her chest. Every sense felt sharper, as though the air itself carried her. Family's presence. She guided the bay south along the dirt road. The world narrowed to the rhythmic thud of hooves and her own breath. The sun dipped lower, casting elongated shadows across the plains. The homestead's small farm buildings emerged in the distance, whitewashed walls gleaming, fences bowing, under the weight of late-blooming lilies, and the familiar silhouette of Pa's barn standing against the sky. Her heart pounded so fiercely she thought it might burst in her chest. She urged her bay to a trot, then to a canter. With each passing fence post, her memories flooded back. The oak tree where she had hidden behind on hot summer days, Tuck chasing chickens in the yard, her mother's lavender soaps buzzed with bees in the garden. The Wainwright place, a sanctuary of simple joys, stood just beyond her reach. At the gate, a figure emerged with wild arms. Tuck. He dashed forward, his straw hat flapping in his outstretched hand, eyes wide with joy and disbelief. The bay neighed as Mary Beth reined it in, sweat streaking her dusty cheeks. She squeezed the reins, bringing the horse to a halt. Then she slid from the saddle, boots crunching on the dry earth. "Tuck!" Her voice cracked as she buried her, arms around her younger brother, his laughter light and relieved. He pulled her tight, as though ensuring she was real, pressing his cheek against hers. Mary Beth felt a surge of emotions, relief, love, forgiveness. Pa emerged from the porch of the clapboard house, rifle resting against the railing. His broad shoulders and salt and pepper beard were unmistakable. He strode toward them, his face mixture of joy and lingering fear. "Mary Beth," he said, voice thick with emotion. He dropped the rifle and enveloped her in a bear hug, lifting her off the ground for a heartbeat. "God be praised." Mary Beth pressed her face into his neck, breathing in the scent of worn leather and lavender soap. "I'm home, Pa." He set her down, staring at her face as though memorizing every detail. Then he stepped back and wiped a tear from his eye. "How did you... where?" She glanced at the horizon, where the fading light cast long shadows. Across the plains. "I was lost, but someone guided me home." She lifted her hand to brush a stray lock of hair from her face, her gaze drifting to the east. Pa followed her line of sight, noticing the bay and the empty saddle where a stranger once rode. He placed a hand on Tuck's shoulder, then turned back to Mary Beth. His voice was low and tremored with gratitude. "Who?" Mary Beth hesitated, tears welling in her eyes. "He's Navajo. He saved me in the Badlands and guided me to Shiprock." She swallowed, searching for his face in her mind's eye. "He never asked for anything in return." Tuck's eyes glimmered. "Mary Beth, Mama's been calling you for days." Mary Beth patted Tuck's back gently. "I know." She turned to Pa. "Father Beaumont and the shepherd asked that I not reveal his name." Pa's brow furrowed. "But you must find him. He's part of our family now." Mary Beth nodded, gazing into the lengthening shadows of the dust-choked plains. "I will, someday. But for now, I've found home." As they walked across the yard toward the clapboard house, Tuck's arm looped through hers, Pa's hand on her shoulder, Mary Beth felt the weight of the journey recede. She inhaled the familiar scents, fresh-turned soil, lavender, and the faintest echo of juniper from the Badlands beyond. She paused at the threshold, looking back once toward the horizon, where Shiprock's silhouette warned of all that lay between them and her new life. The sun dipped below the western rim, casting the Wainwright homestead in a glow of honeyed light. Mary Beth stepped inside as her mother embraced her, the warmth of home closing around her like a blanket. The last golden rays settled on her face, and she closed her eyes, feeling both fragile and invincible. In the distance, a lone coyote howled, and the shadows of the Badlands whispered of the shepherd who would forever remain a guardian in her heart. End of Part 2. That story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now back to the story. Mary Beth's breath caught in her throat as she stepped from the moonlit ridge into the yawning maw of the Red Flint Cave. The air around her shifted, carrying the faint tang of minerals and the distant rhythmic drip of unseen water. Each careful step deeper into the cave felt like crossing a threshold between two worlds, the world she had reclaimed and the world that had demanded her penance. The lanterns slung from her belt cast flickering shadows along the walls, transforming the jagged profusion of red flint into a paling constellation of shifting shapes. She moved forward, the parchment clutched in her hand, its edges now soft and worn from her grip. The warning it bore lingered at the back of her mind. "You have trespassed on sacred ground. The balance has been broken." She swallowed, forcing herself to keep moving. A low hum seemed to emanate from the cave's depths, a reverberation that pulsed through her bones. It was as if the very rock murmured with the weight of ancient grievances. A single bead of sweat trickled down her brow despite the cave's chill, and she wiped it away with the back of her hand. The passage narrowed, forcing her to duck beneath a low arch of flint that scraped her hair as she passed. The lantern's light danced across crystalline veins, sending shards of reflected glow that flickered like distant stars. Mary Beth felt a ripple of awe. This was a place carved by time and elemental force, a place that demanded reverence, not the heedless footsteps of an intruder. As she progressed, the hum grew louder, resonating until she could feel it in her chest. Each inhale brought with it the cave's primal scent, earth, stone, and something indescribably old. The path sloped downward, and her footsteps echoed off the walls in uneven cadence, as though the cave itself balked at her intrusion. She clenched, her jaw, and pressed forward. Mary Beth's heart pounded with a mixture of fear and determination. The shepherd's voice echoed in her mind. "You must not falter." She steeled herself, recalling her journey through the Badlands, the blistering sun, the thirst, the uncanny stillness of the ravine where she first found water, and the shepherd's calm presence beside her. She owed him more than gratitude. She owed the land respect and now reparation. The corridor widened into a vast chamber, its ceiling disappearing into darkness. Flint pillars jutted from floor to vault, each a pillar of rusty crimson that glittered in the lamplight. Stalactites overhead dripped with water. The hum intensified, vibrating like a chant, filling every crevice of her mind with a low, vibrating energy. She took a cautious step forward, and the ground beneath her trembled. Subtle, but unnerving tremor. Her heart seized, and she halted. The lantern in her right hand wavered, its beam tilting to reveal a cluster of red flint formations that curved like the ribs of some colossal beast. They surrounded a small outcropping of rock, upon which lay a shallow pool of water, its surface mirror smooth in the dim light. Marybeth's breath caught. She recognized the pool from legends she'd once heard from the shepherd, tales of a place where the land spirit listened to petitions and offered both judgment and mercy. To gaze into its waters was to face one's true self, unmasked and unflinching. She moved to the pool's edge, eyes wide. As she peered into the reflection, she half expected her own face to warp, to reveal deeper truths she might not be ready to face. But the water shivered, and in its depths she saw herself, hair tangled, clothes stained with dust and sweat. But those eyes were fierce and bright, flickering with a hard-won clarity. A low growl erupted behind her. Marybeth stiffened and whirled around, lantern raised. For a fleeting moment, her pulse froze at the sight of a coyote's ghostly form, pelts the color of moonlit ash, eyes like burning embers emerging from a crevice. It padded toward her with silent grace, a creature neither fully alive nor dead. Its breath steamed in the cold air, and each step felt deliberate, as though it was the sentry of this sacred place. Marybeth's legs trembled, but she forced herself to stand her ground. The coyote circled the pool, pausing now and then to stare directly at her with a piercing gaze, as though judging her intent. She swallowed, lifted the parchment higher. Its missive, pressed against her ribs, read like a plea and an accusation. In equal measure, the coyote let out a low, resonant howl, more felt than heard. In that sound lingered centuries of sorrow, of the land's quiet suffering under the tread of settlers. Marybeth felt a shiver that ran through her spine. Her breath, and caught between regret and resolve, she spoke, voice barely above a whisper. "I come to make amends. I did not know this was sacred." She held the parchment above the pool's surface, contemplation mingling with longing. "I bring this to you, to set right what I took, if I have taken anything." The coyote's eyes gleamed, and it took a step closer, nose twitching as though sniffing the air around her. Marybeth unwrapped the parchment, unfolding it until it fluttered in the murky light like a dying leaf. The coyote froze, gaze fixed on the parchment, as though recognizing its importance. She knelt by the pool, holding the parchment between thumb and forefinger. The hum grew louder, the cave resonating with unspoken tension. She lowered the parchment as close to the water as she dared, but did not allow it to touch the surface. The coyote's head tilted, ears erect, as though waiting. For her next move, Marybeth took a deep breath, heart hammering. The weight of her actions pressed on her chest, like the unrelenting desert sun. She whispered, "If this, whatever I have done, has disturbed the land, then accept this offering. Let the balance be restored." Her fingertips brushed the parchment's edge. The hum peaked, and the surface of the water rippled, spreading rings outward from a point she could not see. The reflection of the cave walls danced, and for a moment the lantern's light fractured into shimmering fragments. A voice, low and resonant, emanated from the walls, an echo that seemed older than memory. "Show your heart." Marybeth's breath caught. The coyote stepped into the pool's shallow edge, water lapping at its ankles, and stared at her unblinking. She swallowed, lowered her head, and laid the parchment on the water's surface. As the parchment drifted, its edges curling, a gust of wind swept through the chamber, snuffing the lantern's flame. Darkness surrounded her, thick and absolute, pierced only by the faint glow of red flint. The coyote remained on the pool's edge, luminous eyes locked on her. Marybeth felt her pulse surge, her every sense heightened. In the darkness, the whisper returned, softer yet more urgent. "Show your heart." Marybeth pressed a trembling hand to her chest, feeling the rapid thrum of her own heartbeat. She closed her eyes, letting memory flood over her. The day she first held a rifle in her father's hands, the taste of sweat and dust under the blistering sun, the moment her father had taught her the land's secrets. She saw Tuck's laugh, her mother's gentle eyes, and the look of resolve in the shepherd's face when he first extended his hand to help her. Tears welled in her eyes as realization dawned. This was not simply a test of humility, but a confrontation with her own intentions and guilt. She opened her eyes toward the coyote, voice trembling. "I have taken what did not belong to me, land, water, and the quiet of this place. I sought refuge and guidance in the Badlands, knowing I had no right. I vowed to honor this land, to protect it, and to carry its lessons back to those who follow." The coyote's head bobbed, as though acknowledging her words. The water stilled, and the cave's roar fell silent, as if waiting. Slowly, the lantern flickered back to life, its flame sputtering before steadying. In its light, Marybeth saw the coyote's form begin to dissolve into a fine mist, leaving behind a single red flintstone glowing with an inner light. She staggered back, heart pounding, and reached for the stone. It was warm to the touch, smooth and heavy in her palm. She felt a surge of power and responsibility wash over her, a promise from the land that her offering had been accepted, but the bond was not yet complete. A new voice, deep and ancient, rumbled from the cavern floor. "Prove your devotion." Marybeth's breath caught. She turned toward the cave's depths and saw an arch of flint beyond the pool. The path extended further, narrowing until it vanished into darkness. She realized the journey had only begun. To fully restore the balance, she would need to undertake. Whatever trial lay ahead, the wolf coyote had been the sentinel. Now, a deeper test awaited, one that would demand a sacrifice greater than her offering of parchment. She stepped forward, the flint stone clenched in her hand, the lantern steady before her. Each footfall echoed in the chamber, a drumbeat marking her resolve. As she moved beyond the pool, the hum receded into a hush, replaced by the distant drip of unseen water. And then the floor gave way beneath her boots, spilling her into a narrow fissure below. The walls closed in, and darkness swallowed her whole, save for the hazy glow of the flintstone. A final whisper echoed around her. "Prove your devotion. Survive." Marybeth pressed on into the abyss, every step a testament to her determination, to breathe life back into the land she had trespassed upon. Marybeth's body tumbled into darkness, landing hard on a ledge slick with moisture. Pain radiated through her ribs and shoulders, but she forced herself to stay still, breathing deeply to quell the shock. The glow of the red flintstone pulsed in her palm, casting fractured light against damp walls. She rose slowly, testing her limbs before pressing forward along a narrow passage that sloped downward. The air grew warmer and more oppressive as she descended. The lantern light revealed walls etched by centuries of water, flint veins rippling like frozen flames. The hum, now a distant echo, gave way to silence, broken only by her own ragged breathing. Each step felt like a step deeper into the very soul of the earth, a descent into trials she barely understood. Marybeth pressed the flintstone against the wall, its glow flickering in response, guiding her like a compass. She recalled the shepherd's teachings. Respect the land, tread lightly, give back more than you take. But she also knew that talk was meaningless here. The red flint's light sharpened her awareness. She could sense unseen currents of energy. Pulsing through the rock, a low rumble shook the passage, and Marybeth stumbled, nearly dropping the lantern. She steadied herself, heart hammering. Dust sifted from the ceiling, motes dancing in the lantern's glow. The ground beneath her feet vibrated, as though the earth itself thrummed with anticipation. Ahead, the walls diverged, revealing a vast subterranean cavern. Marybeth stepped into the open space, feeling the air shift. The cavern's roof arched, high above, studded with stalactites that glistened like frozen chandeliers. In the center, a pool of black water lay still, reflecting the crags above as though mirroring another world. At the pool's edge stood a figure draped in tattered robes, its form cloaked in shadow. The lantern's light did not pierce the darkness. Of its hollow eyes, Marybeth's breath caught when she recognized the face, the shepherd, yet not the shepherd she had known. This was an older, more spectral version, the faint outline of a hood concealing cheeks sunken by years of wandering. He lifted a bony hand, and in it a token gleamed, a silver feather, worn and tarnished. Marybeth's heart stuttered, her breath shallowed. She recalled the shepherd's necklace, the lone white feather that had dangled from its leather cord. The token shimmered like a relic of the sacred. The hooded figure's voice echoed through the cavern, a low, reverberating intonation that seemed to emanate from the very stone. "Marybeth Wainwright," it began, "you stand at the crossroads of atonement. To prove your devotion, you must face the reflection of your deeds." The spectral shepherd raised the silver feather higher, and the black pool rippled, its surface roiling like storm-tossed waters. Marybeth stepped closer, caution warring with the urge to understand. She gripped the red flint, its warmth a small comfort. The pool parted in the center, dividing into two channels that revealed a submerged path lined with flint crystals. They glowed faintly, illuminating an archway on the cavern's far side. Marybeth swallowed and took a step forward, the shepherd's shadow drifting behind her like an accusation. As she reached the pool's edge, the surface shimmered to reveal the first vision, the overturned wagon. Her father, calling her name in frantic dismay, Tuck's terrified eyes as the wheels pitched them toward the ravine. The memory coiled in her chest like a serpent. Marybeth's throat constricted. She had lived that moment 1,000 times, every detail etched into her bones. The water turned black, then refracted into a second vision. The moment she stumbled into the narrow ravine, each step fraught with danger as heat and dust burned her lungs. She felt the weight of every misstep, each decision that led her deeper into peril. The vision dissolved, replaced by the cave's ghostly reflection. The spectral shepherd's hollow eyes fixed on her. "You have claimed refuge, but at what cost? What have you taken from the land?" Marybeth closed her eyes, remembering the baptism of the pool in the upper chamber, the coyote's judgment, and the sacrifice of the parchment. She opened her eyes to the lantern's flicker. "I have taken water, shelter, guidance," she whispered, "but I return what I can, and more." The shepherd's form wavered, and the pool's surface rippled again, morphing into a third vision, her family's homestead, fertile fields, her mother's gentle touch as she coaxed crops from the earth, Tuck laughing in the orchard. The homestead seemed to shimmer with life, a fragile beacon of hope amidst the stark desert. The spectral shepherd's voice trembled like wind through reeds. "Can you protect this future? Will you honor this bond?" Marybeth's gaze hardened. She moved to the edge of the pool and stared into the depths. "I will protect it. I will honor this bond with every breath." Pain and resolve churned within her, an oath forged in desert heat and tested in darkness. The flint crystals along the submerged path flared to life, casting a phosphorescent glow that highlighted the archway beyond. The shepherd's robed form drifted closer, gesturing toward the arch. Marybeth swallowed, then stepped into the pool's shallows, letting the water lap at her calves. Each step sent ripples across the surface, distorting the reflections of the ceiling's jagged stalactites. She gripped the flintstone, the red light brightening to cut through the inky pool. Halfway across, the water deepened, reaching her knees. A chill sank into her bones, but she forced her feet forward until the water brushed her waist. The flint's warm glow revealed the submerged flint crystals lining her path. They jutted like the spines of ancient beasts. She stepped carefully, to avoid the sharp edges. Abruptly, the water surged around her, pulling her toward the center of the pool. Waves churned the reflections, and Maribeth fought to maintain her footing. The flintstone shook in her grip, its red light flickering. A shape emerged from the pool's depths, a massive fin of flint, glimmering like a blade. It arced above the water, sending a shockwave that sent Maribeth stumbling backward. She lost, her footing, arms flailing, and the water surged overhead. When she regained the surface, she found herself submerged to her chin, the flintstone still clenched in her hand. Bubbles escaped her lips as she kicked upward. The lantern, still slung at her belt, swung in an arc overhead. She gasped for air as her head broke the surface. The spectral shepherd stood at the archway above, his hollow gaze fixed on her. "Prove your devotion," his voice echoed. Maribeth swam toward the arch, each stroke passing through cold darkness that felt alive, swarming with unseen currents that tugged at her limbs. She could feel the weight of the flint crystals anchored beneath her, pulling her toward a hidden depth. She fought the pull, driven by her vow to safeguard the homestead's future. She reached the archway, hoisting herself from the water. The cavern floor was slick with moisture, and the phosphorescent crystals gave off a faint, ghostly glow. She collapsed onto the stone, chest heaving, the weight of seconds stretching. Into an eternity, the spectral shepherd drifted down the stairs, cut into the side of the arch, his robes whispering against the floor. The silver feather gleamed in his hand, and he placed it atop a small altar of flint beneath a pool of stagnant water. Maribeth watched, breath trembling. The pool's surface glowed a deep crimson, and the air thickened, a breeze, warm and scented. With sage, swept through the chamber. Maribeth rose unsteadily, stepping toward the altar. The shepherd's hollow eyes followed her. "Place the feather upon the water's heart," he murmured. The altar's pool was shallower, its surface smooth as polished glass. Maribeth approached and kneeled by the pool. She reached out, touching the water's surface with the tip of her finger. It felt unnaturally warm, like blood pulsing beneath skin. She lifted the silver feather and hesitated, recalling the shepherd's act of placing it there. With a determined breath, she lowered it onto the water's heart. The moment the feather touched the surface, the pool erupted in ripples, sending waves across the phosphorescent crystals. The red flintstone in her hand flared, its light blazing so brightly that Maribeth instinctively shielded her eyes. A low roar shook the cavern, and columns of light shot down from the ceiling, illuminating trails of dust spinning in the air. The shepherd's form flickered, then resolved into solidity. He gazed at Maribeth, his hollow eyes now half filled with something that resembled gratitude. "You have faced the depths," he intoned. "You have paid homage to the land's ancient heart. The balance is restored, yet the bond endures." Poe. Cavern's roar subsided until only the whisper of dripping water remained. The red flintstone in Maribeth's hand dimmed, its glow fading to a soft ember. The phosphorescent crystals around the archway pulsed one last time before settling into a calm luminescence. Maribeth sank to her knees, chest heaving, as though the world had shifted beneath her. The shepherd stepped forward, extending a hand to help her to her feet. She grasped it, feeling the warmth of flesh, the solidity of bone. Relief and exhaustion warred within her. He nodded once, his robes brushing the stone floor. "Go now. Return to your family and carry the land's lessons with you. You are its steward, as much as water, rock, and sky." Maribeth bowed her head, breathing deeply. She turned toward the archway. The flint crystals along the submerged path glowed faintly, beckoning her. She stepped into the shimmering light and retraced her steps through the tunnel. The passageway wound upward, each step feeling lighter than the last. The hum that had once pulsated through the cave was gone, replaced by an almost imperceptible sigh, like the land exhaling in relief. Finally, she emerged into the cavern above, blinking against the flicker of the lantern's flame. The coyote was nowhere to be seen. The reflection pool lay still, the red flint offering resting at its edge. Marybeth held the flint stone in her hand, as though it were a piece of her own heart. She lifted her gaze as the shepherd's silhouette appeared at the chamber's entrance. Head bowed, they remained there, silent and still, until the first faint glow of dawn began to seep through the cave's mouth. The shepherd stepped forward, and Marybeth followed, each footfall reverberating with the promise of a new day. At the cave's mouth, dawn's golden light painted the Badlands in shades of rose and lavender. The air was crisp, alive with the scent of sage and desert bloom. Marybeth squinted against the sun's glare, seeing distant plateaus and the spire of shiprock etched against the sky. The shepherd stood beside her, the silver feather tucked into his belt. He turned to Marybeth, a faint smile ghosting his lips. "You have honored the land," he said softly. "May your family prosper under its watch." Marybeth nodded, unable to find the words. She pressed the red flint stone to her heart, feeling its warmth seep into her skin. She listened to the desert wind, carrying the echoes of the trials she had faced. Behind her the cave seemed to sigh, its sacred charge fulfilled. The shepherd took a step back, merging with the shadows at the cave's mouth. Marybeth watched, his form dissolve into the light and the rock, until only a memory remained. She turned away from the cave and began the journey home, a long but different path than the one she had taken before. Each step felt grounded in purpose and gratitude. The first rays of dawn painted the land in hues of promise, and Marybeth breathed deeply, holding the red flint in her palm as both a reminder and a gift. She would return to her family, carrying the land's lessons in her heart. The balance was restored, and the bond endured. This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now back to the story. Marybeth's return from the Red Flint Cave felt like awakening from a dream, both haunting and luminous. The dawn's first light crept across the jagged spires of the Badlands, painting them in shades of rose and gold. She paused at the caves, mouth, heart pounding, folding the red flint stone into the folds of her skirt. The world beyond the cave whispered with the promise of a new day, and she inhaled the desert air, cool, crisp, alive. Below her, the vast expanse unfolded, ragged, ridges of sandstone, skeletal junipers clinging to life, and the distant shadow of shiprock standing sentinel against the sky. The shepherd's silhouette lingered in the cave's darkened entrance, his figure half-blended with the rock. His dark eyes met hers, and in that moment, Marybeth felt the weight of everything she had endured and overcome. He offered a subtle nod, and then, as though a wind had swept his form away, he melted into the cave's shadows. Marybeth's breath caught. She wanted to run back, to thank him with words that felt inadequate. But she also understood that his path lay within the land, bound to its ancient rhythms, while hers led back to the life she had fought so hard to salvage. She turned away, stepping onto the rough earth beneath her boots. Each step felt both heavy with remembrance and light with relief. The journey back to her family's homestead would take her twice as long as the outward trek, for she needed to traverse the breadth of the Badlands again, but this time burdened, not by fear, but by purpose, to return as a guardian, carrying the land's lessons as faithfully as one might carry water across a desert. Marybeth tucked the red flint stone into a leather pouch at her waist and slid the lantern's hook from her belt, letting it dangle against her thigh. The morning sun climbed higher, and the wind shifted, whispering through the spines of sandstone like an old storyteller's voice. She remembered the shepherd's final words. "Go now, return to your family, and carry the land's lessons. With you, You are its steward, as much as water, rock, and sky." Those words resonated deep within her, forging a bond between her heart and the land she had once trespassed upon. She began her descent, retracing her steps through the cavern, until the narrow passage gave way to the broader chamber where the coyote sentinel had stood. Marybeth's eyes swept across the reddened flint pillars, their surfaces glittering in the faint morning glow that filtered in from the cave's mouth behind her. The black pool of the trial chamber lay motionless, its surface reflecting the quiet shafts of light. She knelt at its edge, dipping her fingers into the cool water. It rippled gently, unveiling the reflection of the cavern's ceiling. Her face appeared in the water for a heartbeat, haggard, determined, humbled, before the image shimmered and dissolved. Marybeth closed her eyes, offering a silent vow that her stewardship would not end with the trial's conclusion, but would continue in each breath she took, each seed she sowed, and each step she placed on the land. Rising, she moved through the chamber's width and ascended the slope that led back to the upper cavern. The hum that had once thrummed through the rock was now a memory, a distant echo that faded with each step. When she emerged into the open, the shepherd's form was gone, as though he had never been there. Only the red flint stone in her pouch confirmed the reality of his guidance. The wind stirred, rippling across the exposed ridge, and Marybeth wrapped her arms against a faint chill. Ahead lay the Badlands, their ridges carved by wind and water into a labyrinth of peril and possibility. She hefted her satchel, adjusted her hat, and set her gaze westward toward Shiprock, then turned south, orienting herself toward the familiar contours of the plains that would lead her back to her family. The early hours of her journey through the Badlands were solitary and stark. The sun climbed steadily, gilding the rock faces in a brittle white heat. At each ridge crest, she paused to survey the terrain, to commit every fold of earth, every gnarled juniper to memory. She followed the same landmarks that had guided her into danger. The tall spire of quartz that gleamed like a beacon, the cluster of boulders that formed a natural amphitheater, and the broad wash where she had found the trickle of water that saved her life. As noon approached, the sun boiled overhead, and the wind stung her skin with dust. She paused at a narrow ravine, its walls sloping steeply into a basin where parched sagebrush clung to life. She knelt to place her hand on the cracked earth, remembering the time when thirst had been her greatest enemy and how the shepherd had shown her where to drink. She closed her eyes, feeling a surge of gratitude that swelled within her like a spring. She continued on, taking deliberate steps, her mind replaying the shepherd's guidance. Respect the land, tread lightly. Give back more than you take. She thought of the parchment's offering in the upper chamber and the silver feather's trial in the lower cavern. Each act of humility, each vow she made, had woven her fate into the fabric of the land. By late afternoon, the sun dipped below midday's zenith and the heat's intensity softened. The jagged silhouettes of the Badlands yielded to rolling plains dotted with sage and yucca. She followed a faint game trail that she recognized, the same path she and the shepherd had taken toward Shiprock. As she neared the foot of the final plateau, Marybeth paused and brushed dust from her skirts. Below, the plains stretched out, their grasses bending in gentle waves beneath the breeze. In the distance, she spotted the spire of Shiprock one last time, then turned her gaze southward to where fields and fences marked the edge of her family's land. With renewed energy, she crossed the plateau and began the descent. The trail wove through stands of juniper and clumps of brittle sage. She navigated each bend with confidence, for each had been burned into her memory during her approach weeks before. The anticipation fluttered in her chest. She was close at last to the homestead that had become both a place of refuge and a promise of return. When she crested the final rise, her breath hitched. The Wainwright homestead sprawled below, The clapboard house, with its whitewashed walls, the barn's red roof glinting in the sun, and the fence lines cutting across fields sown with young wheat. Smoke curled from the chimney, and the distant bleat of sheep drifted on the wind. She could almost hear her mother's gentle humming and smell the sweet scent of lavender from the herb garden. Mary Beth felt a surge of emotion, relief, joy, and a pang of regret that she had been gone so long. She took a moment to steady herself, brushing away tears that threatened. Then she began her final descent, her steps quickening as she strode toward home. The yard lay quiet as she approached. Tuck was out in the orchard, his lanky frame moving among the trees as he tended to the last of the season's pruning. He paused and looked up, shading his eyes with one hand. His eyes widened and a grin spread across his face, familiar, irrepressible. "Mary Beth!" he called, dropping his pruning shears and sprinting toward her. She dropped the satchel and knelt in the path. When Tuck reached her, he threw his arms around her, nearly knocking her over with the force of his greeting. She laughed through relieved tears and squeezed him tight. "I'm home," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She glanced at the house, where her mother emerged onto the porch, hands pressed to her heart. Amelia dropped to her knees and wrapped Mary Beth in an embrace that felt like the shelter of dawn. Mary Beth closed her eyes and breathed in the scent of her mother's dress, lavender, fresh bread, and something unnameable that spoke of safety. Behind them, Pa hurried across the yard, calling her name. When he reached them, his broad shoulders trembled, and he dropped the fence post he carried, stepping forward to envelop Mary Beth in a bear hug. She pressed her face against his shirt, whimpering softly. "I thought I'd lost you," he whispered into her hair. "Thank God you're safe." Mary Beth pressed back against him, tears wetting her cheek. "I'm here, Pa, I'm here." They rose, and Pa guided her toward the porch as Amelia and Tuck followed, their faces shining with relief. The clapboard floorboards groaned under their weight, and the door swung open to reveal the warm glow of the interior. Inside, the scent of stew simmering on the stove filled the air. The table was set with bowls and fresh bread. A neighbor and friend, Mrs. Sanderson, sat reading by the hearth, her kindly eyes widening as she saw Mary Beth. "Bless the Lord!" Mrs. Sanderson exclaimed, rising to her feet. She hurried across the room, enveloping Mary Beth in a motherly hug. "My dear, I thought the Badlands had claimed you forever." Mary Beth stepped back, smiling through tears. "I made it back," she said softly. Pa placed a calloused hand on her shoulder. "She's weary, but she's alive." He directed Mary Beth to the table. "Sit and eat. Tell us everything." Mary Beth settled into her seat as Amelia ladled steaming stew into a bowl, handing Mary Beth a slice of fresh bread. The warm food tasted like heaven after her long journey through dusty silence. She took a bite, then paused, gathering strength. Before speaking, she told them of the cave, how the red flint's glow had guided her, how the coyote's sentinel had judged her, and how she had offered the parchment and faced her guilt. She recounted the trial's depths, the black pool's vision, the plunge into cold water, the trial of the silver feather, and finally, her passage to the chamber's cavernous heart. She spoke of the shepherd's spectral guidance, the altars, flame, and the moment she placed the feather on the water's heart. As she spoke, Pa's gaze softened with awe. Amelia's eyes glistened with tears, and Tuck stared at her with wide-eyed admiration. Mrs. Sanderson listened quietly, her lips pressed together in reverent silence. When Mary Beth finished, a hush settled over the room. Pa reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers trembling. "You have proven yourself," he said, voice thick with emotion. "More than any frontier girl ought to do alone." Mary Beth met his gaze, warmth blooming in her chest. "I have only begun to prove myself," she replied. "The land's bond is my responsibility now." Amelia rose, crossing to a small cabinet in the corner and retrieving a folded cloth embroidered with sage and cedar patterns. She pressed it into Marybeth's hand. "This is for you," she said. "Our family's blessing." Marybeth unfolded the cloth, her eyes widening at the intricate stitching. Tuck leaned forward, squinting. "It belonged to your grandmother," Amelia explained. "She said it would guide any Wainwright who walked true of heart. Now it returns to you." Marybeth pressed the cloth to her chest as though it were a talisman. "Thank you, Mama." Her voice trembled. Pa cleared his throat. "It's late, and you need rest. But tomorrow we will celebrate your return and gather the neighbors. You've earned your place among us, more than any of us could imagine." Marybeth nodded, overwhelmed by the love enveloping her. She rose and followed Pa to a small bedroom down the hall where linens and blankets were fresh and inviting. Before she left the table, Tuck slipped an arm around her waist. "You're my hero," he murmured. "Don't forget that." Marybeth smiled and ruffled his hair. "I won't, little brother." She climbed the narrow stairs to her old bedroom, pausing at the threshold to take in the familiar surroundings. The faded quilt on the bed, the wooden rocking chair by the window, and the small desk where she had once tried her hand at penmanship. Everything felt the same, yet she knew she was not the same. After changing into fresh linens, she lay in bed, tracing the quilt's embroidered patterns with a trembling finger. The red flint's warmth pulsed faintly in her satchel at the foot of the bed, a reminder of the promise she had made to the land. At dawn, Marybeth rose and dressed in her worn riding skirt and sturdy boots. She stepped outside onto the porch. The morning sun cast a soft glow across the fields, and the wind sighed through the orchard's budding branches. Pa and Tuck stood waiting at the gate, and on the horizon, neighbors had gathered. Mr. Thompson, whose sheep grazed nearby, the Carters, who tended the general store, and several families from the settlement's outskirts, each curious to glimpse the young woman who had ventured into the Badlands and returned transformed. Marybeth walked down the path to meet them. Each nod of acknowledgement, each whispered greeting, felt like a thread weaving her into the community's tapestry. She saw Mrs. Sanderson among the crowd, her kindly eyes shining. The neighbors formed a semicircle around Marybeth as Pa stepped forward, lifting a hand to quiet the murmurs. "Neighbors, friends," Pa began, voice carrying across the gathering. "My daughter Marybeth walked into the Badlands a fortnight ago and returned a guardian of this land. She faced trials no one else could endure, facing thirst, fear, and the ancient judgment of the Red Flint Cave. Yet she prevailed." Murmurs of awe spread through the crowd. Marybeth felt her cheeks burn, but met each neighbor's gaze with steady. His Pa continued, "Today we recognize her bond with this land. Let her be our steward, one who understands that every seed we plant, every furrow we plow, must honor the earth that sustains us." From the gathered families, Mr. Thompson stepped forward, his weathered face solemn. "If she can guide us to live in harmony with the land's spirit, then we shall follow." He nodded to Marybeth. "We trust you, young lady." Others voiced their agreement, pledging support and offering help in tending the fields in ways that respected the soil and honored the water that fed it. Marybeth felt tears prick her eyes. She had never expected such acceptance. Yet here, in this moment, she realized that her trial meant not only her own redemption, but also a chance to teach her community how to live in reverence of the land. In the days that followed, Marybeth woke before dawn. She tended the fields with Pa and Tuck, guiding them in planting new rows of wheat along contour lines that would reduce erosion. She showed them how to dig small trenches to catch rainwater, channeling it to young saplings. Instead of letting it rush past uselessly, she taught them to leave sections of fallow land, allowing the soil to rest. The neighbors watched, asked questions, and listened in a way that spoke of respect, not merely compliance. They built simple terraces along the steeper slopes of the orchard, preventing the soil from washing away when spring rains came. Mary Beth laced a small red flint stone into the wall of one terrace, a talisman to remind them of the bond they had renewed with the earth. Each evening, as the sun sank below the horizon, Mary Beth walked the fields alone. She knelt by the newly planted seeds, whispered a blessing for their growth, and pressed her palm into the soil, feeling its cool, dark promise beneath her fingers. At night, after Tuck was asleep and the house was silent, she sat by the hearth with her mother, the embroidered cloth on her lap. Amelia placed a gentle hand on her daughter's shoulder. "You have become more than we ever hoped," Amelia said softly. "The land has chosen you as its voice. Now we must listen." Mary Beth nodded, folding the cloth's corners between delicate fingertips. "I will listen, Mama. I will tend the land and protect it, just as it protected me." As summer ripened into harvest, the fields responded. The wheat grew tall and golden, and the orchard's trees burst with fruit. The neighbors convened, working together to bring in the harvest in ways that renewed the soil rather than depleted it. They used cover crops to plant clover and rye in sections that would rest through winter, enriching the ground with nitrogen. Mary Beth directed them in a communal ceremony at the time of the autumn equinox. They gathered at the edge of the orchard, where a low stone marker, the red flint stone embedded in its center, stood as a testament to the bond they had forged. The community joined hands in a circle around the marker, offering thanks for the bounty they had received and pledging to honor the land in seasons to come. Pa stood beside Mary Beth, quiet pride shining in his eyes. Tuck held his sister's hand, looking up at her with awe. Mrs. Sanderson and other neighbors carried bowls of roasted wheat berries and dried fruit, passing them around so each family could partake in the harvest's first fruits. When the ceremony ended, Mary Beth spoke, her voice clear and unwavering. "Let us not forget that the land sustains us, that every seed we plant depends on the earth's generosity. We take only what we need, and we give back. May this red flint remind us that we have a duty not just to ourselves, but to the generations yet to come." The community stood in solemn agreement, the crisp autumn air filled with hope and resolve. As winter approached, Mary Beth prepared to teach the children of the settlement, Tuck included, how to read the land's subtle signs, the way a single purple wildflower indicated rich soil, the path of deer tracks that pointed to water sources, and the murmurs of wind that foretold coming storms. She carried the embroidered cloth and the red flint stone to each lesson, weaving stories of respect and reverence into every word. The winters on the plains were harsh, but this one felt gentler, as though the land itself had softened under the stewardship they had pledged. When the first snow fell, it blanketed the fields in a hush of white. Mary Beth stood at the orchard's edge, feeling the crisp flakes melt on her cheeks. She closed her eyes and breathed in deeply, recalling the cave's darkness and the glow of the red flint. She opened her eyes to see Pa and Tuck approaching, bundled against the cold. Pa held an armful of firewood, Tuck trailing behind with a small bundle of dried sage and cedar boughs, preparations for a winter ritual. They stood together at the orchard's edge, and Mary Beth reached into her pocket to touch the red flint stone's smooth surface. She drew a deep breath and closed her eyes. In the heart of winter, when the land sleeps beneath the snow, we still listen to its wisdom, she murmured. She pressed the red flint into the snow at the base of a young sapling, placing it like a seed beneath the frost. "We honor you, O earth. We wait for your renewal." Tuck knelt beside her and placed the dried sage and cedar at the stone's edge. "For generosity and protection," he said quietly. Pa laid the firewood at the tree's roots. "For warmth and sustenance," he added. Mary Beth smiled, tears clouding her vision. "And for hope." They rose together, forming a small circle around the sapling. The wind whispered through the bare branches, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of springs yet unseen. "We offer these gifts," Marybeth intoned, "and we pledge to honor the land spirit until the stars themselves grow old." A hush fell over the orchard, broken only by the rustle of winter wind. Marybeth's heart thrummed with gratitude. She had crossed the threshold between a child lost in the Badlands and a guardian rooted in the earth's ancient covenant. As the three of them walked back to the warmth of the homestead, the red flint stone faded into the white embrace of snow, waiting for spring's thaw. Marybeth brought her hand to her chest, where the embroidered cloth hung from a simple cord around her neck. It felt warm against her skin, a living reminder of the bond she had forged. Inside, the hearth's flames danced with comforting warmth. Amelia stood by the stove, humming as she stirred a pot of stew. The scent of garlic and rosemary wove through the room, mingling with the crackle of logs. Pa sat in the rocking chair, watching the fire's glow, and Tuck balanced a wooden toy on his knee, his eyes bright with excitement for tomorrow's work. Marybeth stepped into the light of the hearth and laid her hand on Pa's shoulder as she moved to stand beside him. Together, they shared a quiet moment of contentment, a family united not only by blood, but by a shared reverence for the land that sustained them. She closed her eyes and offered a silent prayer, for the shepherd who had guided her, for the caves, ancient spirit that had tested her, and for the land whose quiet voice would always be her compass. When she opened her eyes, Pa looked up and smiled. "Your mother says the stew's almost ready." Marybeth nodded and crossed to join Amelia at the stove, setting the embroidered cloth carefully on a shelf above the hearth. Tuck called out, "Marybeth, come sit. The stew's too hot to wait." Marybeth laughed, the sound bright and full of joy. She took her place at the table, and the family gathered around. They ate in comfortable silence, the warmth of the meal and the hearth suffusing the room with a sense of homecoming that went deeper than words. After supper, Pa stood and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered orchard. "Remember this," he said softly, "that the land carries our hopes and our burdens. When we honor it, it honors us in return." Marybeth caught his gaze and nodded. "I will never forget." As night settled and the house lulled into quiet, Marybeth took the red flint stone from the snow outside, a silent vow that the bond they had forged would endure beyond winter's length. She slipped it into her palm, feeling its warmth spread through her fingers. Laying her head on the pillow that night, Marybeth closed her eyes, knowing that her journey had brought her not only back to her family, but closer to the heart of the land itself. She drifted into sleep with the embroidered cloth pressed to her chest and the red flint stone safe beneath her pillow. At daybreak, she would rise to tend the orchard's sleeping trees and care for the frost-covered fields. She would teach the children to recognize the first brave shoots of green emerging from the snow, a testament to resilience and renewal. And through it all, she would carry within her the lessons of the Badlands, to walk lightly, to give generously, and to listen to the land's quiet whispers, for they would always guide her home. 2 more great stories are next. Don't miss them. Subscribe and turn on notifications.